My name is Heather Bingham. I work at the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre. So we manage the World Database on Protected Areas, which you'll be aware of. It's used for the official indicators on progress towards Aichi Target 11 and also Sustainable Development Goals 14 and 15. So we also now manage the World Database on OECMs, which sits alongside the WDPA. And I'm going to talk a bit about how you go about providing information to that database. So firstly, just to talk a bit about why it's important to report. So as you will have been discussing today, OECMs are likely to be very widespread, but we know that they can't be factored into decision making until they're identified and mapped. And until they're identified and mapped, we also can't factor them into tracking Aichi Target 11 and the future Target 2. So we know that we have pretty good information on where protected areas are, or at least where the government protected areas are. But until we know where OECMs are as well, we're kind of missing half of the picture in trying to track these targets. And that makes it very difficult to set global and regional priorities, and it makes it difficult to plan for the future of conservation. So, for example, to plan where new conservation areas should be, and also to plan what other land and sea uses should be. So the World Database on OECMs exists to address all of this, providing a single standardized source of data on the world's OECMs. It was developed at the request of the CBD Conference of the Parties, and it's now used alongside the World Database on Protected Areas to provide official indicators on Aichi Target 11 and in the future, the Target 2 in the post-2020 framework. It's also important to keep in mind that the WDPA and also the World Database on OECMs are used by multiple sectors for decision making. So the more complete the data is, the better informed those decisions made by multiple sectors are going to be. So on how to go about reporting, once an OECM has been identified, so for example, once it's been through an assessment to see whether it meets the OECM criteria, it can be reported to the database. And often this is done by the national government. Data needs to be provided in a specific format, which I'll talk briefly about in a minute, but it's described in a lot more detail in the user manual. So the link for that manual is on the screen currently. So in terms of how to report, there's 3 key steps. So the first is to obtain consent from the governance authority. So this is the people who are making decisions on the ground about how the OECM is managed. So it could be a government authority, it could be an indigenous people or a community, or it could be a private organization or individual. I imagine Harry will have talked earlier about how it's important to obtain consent before going through the OECM assessment process to see whether a site meets the definition. But it's also important to get the consent of the governance authority before providing data to UNEP WCMC, since that data will be publicly available. The second step is to format the data correctly, which again, I'll talk very briefly about in a minute, but is described in a lot more detail in the user manual. And then finally, the third step is to send the data to the email address that's shown on the screen currently. So just to speak briefly about the specific data that we need, the first thing is that we need spatial or GIS data. So this needs to be ideally a polygon, or if a polygon isn't available, then a single point location for each OECM. We also need some descriptive or tabular data. So these are things like the name of the site, the governance type, when it was established. But importantly, you can also include a link to supporting information about why the site is considered to be an OECM. So for example, if you've been through the IUCN methodology and assessed the OECM against each of the criteria, if that assessment is available online, you can provide a link to that. And then that just provides an additional layer of information about why that site is considered to be an OECM. And the third thing is a signed data contributive agreement. And again, all of these things are described in a lot more detail in the user manual. And you're very welcome to contact me or any of my colleagues if you have questions about formatting the data. So thank you. And my email address is shown on the screen. Do feel free to get in touch if you would like to discuss any of this further.